Now to two developing stories, both opening new questions about Donald Trump's corrosive effect on the federal government. Late today, the New York Times reporting Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross threatened to fire top employees at NOAA after employees at the Birmingham office contradicted Trump's claim that Hurricane Dorian might strike Alabama. The Commerce Department calling the story about Ross, quote, false. It builds on reporting from this morning that NOAA's chief scientist is investigating why the agency backed Trump over its own experts. All of this reviving so-called Sharpiegate, where Trump displayed a doctored map of Dorian's path. The other story we're following is about Trump's Turnberry Golf Resort in Scotland. Political reporting today that Air Force crew members stayed there last fall. Now, that's in addition to an overnight stop at Turnberry they made this spring, a trip revealed on Friday. Political reporting, the military has also spent $11 million on fuel at a small commercial airport nearby, helping to keep the airport in business. Joining me now is Tim O'Brien, executive editor of Bloomberg View and author of Trump Nation. His new piece is on Trump, Sharpiegate, Turnberry, the Taliban, and chaos. Well, you had to do a lot of research for that one, Tim O'Brien, I imagine. Pack a lot of heat into one title. And back it with me is Elie Mystal. First, I'm going to go with you, Tim, on this one. Give me your take on the U.S. military adding to Trump's, shall we say, bottom line here with stays at Turnberry.
Well, it's not only that they're adding to his bottom line, because they're clearly doing that. It's that members of the federal government, whether the attorney general, the vice president, or the Air Force, are consciously, it would appear, going out of their way to patronize Trump properties. And at a minimum, by lining the president's wallet, either at the Doonbeg Golf Course, the Washington Hotel, or Turnberry in Scotland, they're showing that these institutions that are meant to be in place and be independent are essentially kowtowing to court favor with the president. That's at just a basic level. The larger issue that emerges here are financial conflicts of interest that have dogged Trump since he was inaugurated, since he began campaigning, and the possibility of corruption. Is there pay to play in any of this? And I think the unfortunate thing in all of it is, in some of these instances, it appears that people willingly went to those properties without Trump pushing them along, that they got the message themselves, that if you're in this administration at this time, it behooves you to patronize the president's properties.
So if, in fact, that is the case, what Tim just spelled out, that maybe it's not necessarily a direct message from the president, hey, stop over at this airport, why not stay at my hotel? But instead an indirect message of, we get the message, we'll do this. What are the legal implications of that?
Unfortunately, very much nothing at all. Right. The courts have done, for the past, really during the Roberts Court, they've done a lot to weaken our public corruption laws as they are. I mean, there's a reason why Chris Christie never got charged with Bridgegate, right? Mm-hmm. So they've weakened our public corruption laws as they are. Trump is violating every kind of norm and standard of decency, but he's not violating the letter of the law because there is no letter of the law. And I do think that Democrats should maybe, I don't know, think about that while they hold power in Congress. And certainly if a Democrat wins the presidency, to strengthen our public corruption laws to stop exactly this kind of stuff from happening.
So here's what I think is interesting with all of this is the historical precedent. If we were to look back and see, okay, has the Air Force actually stayed at this Trump resort before Donald Trump was president of the United States? That, in fact, would then say, okay, maybe this has nothing to do with the fact that Donald Trump is now president of the United States, right?
I don't think they...
But you don't think that's accurate?
No, they use Ramstein and other Air Force bases for stopovers.
But let's talk about this airport. And this refueling station. In 2015, they had 95 stops, 2016, 145, and it went up from there. 2018, 257. By this year, 2019, 259 stopovers refueling at this airport.
Right. And patronizing a hotel that for most members of the military is way beyond their ability to pay for that, for accommodations. They're all on per diems. This doesn't fall into their budget. So and it appears from some of the New York Times is reporting that they were given cut rates to stay there. It's important to remember that Turnberry is a money-losing golf course. The president needs as much help as he can get to keep that afloat. And so the other issue that gets raised here are the wheels of the federal government and taxpayer dollars being used to prop up a private business controlled by the president.
Trump is just wetting his beak, right? Like that's how corruption works, right? There's not a secret envelope with a stack of cash in it, right? He's taking something that kind of already happens and he's like, okay, do it a lot more because I'll make more money that way. It's shady. It's wrong. Is it illegal? No, but that's a problem with our laws, and that's a problem that we can fix if Congress and
not easily.
If Congress,
well, I mean, it's in the Constitution. The Emoluments Clause, that big $5
But some could argue
word.
that this is not a violation of the Emoluments Clause, right? The argument can be made for or against the violation of the Emoluments Clause.
But the Emoluments Clause exists to make sure that no one can bribe the President of the United States in order to get policy favors. Those can be domestic or foreign entities. And the Constitution envisioned the possibility of this. What they didn't envision was someone with as deep financial holdings as Trump possesses becoming president.
And they didn't envision one party in the country completely abdicating its responsibility. Like there's supposed to be a public check on public corruption, but the Republicans refuse to do their job, publicly checking the president, and so he can kind of run amok within the letter, if not the spirit of the law.
So Hallie Jackson had the opportunity to ask the president about this today. Let's take a listen to his response.
When a plane stops at a massive international airport and gets fuel, I don't own the airport. I own a lot of different places. Soon you'll find that out. Because I'll be at some point prior to the election, I'm going to be giving out a financial report of me, and it'll be extremely complete.
It'll be extremely complete, Tim O'Brien. You know full well what financial reports of the president look like.
Yeah, Donald Trump is never going to willingly give out a complete financial report about his businesses and finances for a number of reasons. It'll show that his business isn't as big as he's always claimed. It'll show that he's not as generous to charities as he's always claimed. He also doesn't want to get at the possibility that his business is funded from foreign sources. And that's the big thing looming over all these questions about his tax returns and his financial dealings the issue is the President of the United States beholden to any foreign entities who have business or policy or diplomacy in front of the federal government?
So quickly, while I have the two of you, I just want to get to this last thing, and that is Sharpie Gate. That is the new news surrounding Noah and, of course, Wilbur Ross, and threatening to fire some folks for defying the president with regards to Sharpie Gate and all that is Alabama and the hurricane. You wrote in this piece for Bloomberg, you said Sharpie Gate is also magnetic because it exposes the president as the misfit he's always been: juvenile, ill-informed, narcissistic, unapologetic, unhinged. You says, but it has wandered into more serious territory beyond Trump himself that should prick up everyone's ears regardless of their political persuasion. Tim O'Brien, why?
Because he's taken this sort of nonsensical debate with the media about whether he was right about the path of a hurricane, which he could have disposed of by simply saying, I was wrong, let's move on. And he started to force scientists and data analysts in the federal government to change their story, back him up, cover him up, essentially to lie. And I think this gets at the same thing we were speaking about of the U.S. Air Force using his hotels. Donald Trump is corrupting the wheels of the federal government to serve his private interests or his reputational concerns.
The only difference here is that this actually is illegal. Lying about the weather is illegal
Not if you're president.
Because when people do not trust the weather, they die. It is a one-to-one correlation here. If people cannot trust the hurricane reports, then they will not leave when there's a hurricane coming, and some of them will die. So this is a clear illegal activity.
And we have to wrap with that. Tim O'Brien, Ellie Mistel, thank you both, guys.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.